"Know your place," the Duke of Wexford said, and the entire ballroom heard him. Lady Charlotte Ashby did not flinch. She had been raised by a grandmother who taught her that flinching was the sound a soft thing made before it broke, and she had decided, at 17, that she would not be a soft thing. She lifted her chin half an inch, just enough to feel the weight of every chandelier in the Marchioness of Hartwell's autumn ballroom pressed down on her shoulders, and looked at him as one would look at a bad painting that someone insisted was worth viewing. He was very tall. He was very still. He was very certain. "My place," she said, in a voice that did not carry, but somehow reached every ear that mattered, "is wherever I choose to stand, Your Grace. Tonight, I chose to stand here. Tomorrow, I shall choose elsewhere." He had not expected her to answer. She watched the surprise flicker across his hard, beautiful mouth and disappear, replaced by something colder. Around them, the dancers had paused. The orchestra played on. One violinist had not noticed the silence and was sawing his way valiantly through a country reel, but the ballroom itself had stopped breathing. 200 faces, candle-warmed and rouge-bright, watched a duke and an obscure cousin from Kent measure each other across 2 feet of polished oak. Charlotte was 26 years old. She wore a gown of deep ruby silk that her grandmother had ordered cut to her exact measurements before she died, and the firelight caught the ruby and threw it back along her throat in a long, slow flicker. Her hair was the dark, glossy brown of chestnuts in October, pinned simply, and her eyes were the unreadable grey of a winter sea. She was beautiful in a way that did not announce itself, beautiful the way an unfussy room is beautiful, because every line of it had been considered. Anyone who looked twice at her looked 3 times. The Duke of Wexford had looked twice. That was, in fact, the entire problem. "You misunderstand me, madam," he said. His voice was low and very clear, the voice of a man who had been listened to all his life. "I meant the table, the supper table. You have placed yourself among the Marchioness's family. That is not your place." "Ah." She allowed a pause to open between them, the small, patient pause of a tutor with a slow pupil. "Then Your Grace will forgive me. I had assumed Your Grace meant something larger and more interesting. Forgive my disappointment." A laugh broke from somewhere near the orchestra and was hastily smothered. The Duke did not turn his head, but Charlotte saw the muscle along his jaw set, and she understood, with a sudden cold thrill that was not quite pleasure, that she had cost him something. He had meant the entire thing. He had meant every meaning. He had simply named the supper table because it was the smallest of his targets, and he had assumed she would accept it gratefully and slink away. She did not slink. She inclined her head, slow as a queen receiving a clumsy bow, and said, very softly, "Your Grace will excuse me. I find I have no further appetite for supper or your conversation." She turned. She walked the length of the ballroom alone, ruby silk moving like a slow tide around her ankles, and she did not look back, not even when she heard the murmur start up behind her like wind in a wheat field. She did not look back when her godmother's footman opened the carriage door for her in the freezing courtyard. She did not look back as London's lamplit streets fell behind the windows and the dark autumn fields opened ahead. She looked back, finally, only when the carriage was an hour out of town and the moon was climbing high enough to silver the hedgerows. Then she pressed her cheek against the cold glass and allowed herself to feel, for 1 full minute, the precise size of her humiliation. It was very large. It was the size of a ballroom. It was the size of 200 witnesses. The road ran through the dark fields of Middlesex with a steady, business-like rattle, and Charlotte, watching the bare hedgerows pass, set herself, with the careful attention of a woman who had been raised among ledgers, to inventory what had been taken from her in the last quarter of an hour, and what remained. Her invitation to the Marchioness of Hartwell's spring breakfast was gone. Her standing among the supper-table cousins was gone. The 4 men who, in the past 3 weeks, had paid her the sort of careful civilities that might, in a tolerant season, have ripened into a proposal, they were gone too, all 4 of them, and would by Tuesday have been instructed by their mothers to forget her name. The London assembly rooms were closed to her, in any practical sense, for the season. The country house invitations for the new year would not arrive. Her godmother, the Marchioness, who loved her, would write a kind letter. The kindness would be sincere. It would not save anything. What remained? The ruby silk in which she had been insulted, and which she would never in her life cease to wear. The grandmother's writing desk, which had been packed for her last week into its leather travelling case. The lacquer box of letters from the dead Ashby women, which had crossed the country with her since she was 17. Mr. Pellinger's address in Lincoln's Inn Fields, written in her own hand on the inside cover of her pocket diary. The small, almost unspeakable detail, a detail her grandmother had made her commit to memory before she would let her come up to the season at all, that the inheritance from the late Ashby estate, properly counted, was very much larger than London supposed, and that London's supposition was, in this matter as in many others, not Charlotte's concern. When the minute was over, she sat up, smoothed her skirts, and said aloud to no one but the rattle of the wheels, "Very well, Your Grace. We shall see whose place is whose." Mr. Pellinger, of Pellinger and Hodd, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn Fields, was a small round man who had the face of a clever robin and the soul of a sleeping wolf. He had served Charlotte's grandmother for 31 years, and had long ago concluded that the Ashby women were the most dangerous clients in his book, and, by some distance, the most rewarding. He worked by preference in the back room of the chambers, in a leather chair too large for him, with 3 cats on the hearthrug, and a silver inkstand his father had given him at his call to the bar. He kept 2 clerks. He did not employ a partner, although Hodd's name remained on the door, because Hodd had been Pellinger's wife's maiden name, and Pellinger held that no client should be required to entrust his affairs to a single name. The name in pairs felt safer. He received Charlotte at 9 o'clock the next morning, which meant she had ridden through the night to reach him, which meant, Mr. Pellinger thought, as he poured her tea with hands that did not quite tremble, that something extraordinary was about to be required of him. He liked extraordinary things. He had been bored for 3 weeks. The most pressing business at present was a complicated will from a brewer in Hammersmith, and an even more complicated one from a baronet in Hertfordshire, neither of which was the sort of work that woke him in the morning with a sense of pleasant anticipation. The room was warm. The fire was an excellent one. The cats, all 3 of them, had taken note of Charlotte's arrival, and had repositioned themselves in a slow, deliberate council on the hearthrug at her feet, which was a thing they did, in Pellinger's experience, only for clients of whom they approved. Charlotte set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap with the small, settled motion of a woman who had finished thinking. "You are aware," Charlotte said, when she had drunk half her tea, "of the precise extent of the inheritance my grandmother left me." "I am, my lady." "You are aware that it is, by some margin, larger than is generally supposed?" "By a considerable margin, my lady. The greater part has remained in the funds, drawing interest for some years." "Yes." She set down the cup. The cup made no sound. "Mr. Pellinger, I should like to buy a castle." He did not blink. He had served her grandmother. He simply opened a fresh sheet of paper, dipped his pen, and waited. "Castle Marwood," she said, "in Northumberland. It was the seat of the Earls of Marwood, who, as you know, died out in the male line some years ago. The estate is held by trustees on behalf of a distant cousin who is, I understand, a clergyman in Calcutta, with no interest whatever in the British North. The trustees have been looking for a buyer." "They have been looking for a buyer for 11 years, my lady." "Then they will be relieved to find one. I should like the entire estate, castle, domain, 3 farms, the village inn, the fishing rights on the river, and the stand of timber on the western ridge. I should like it under my name, not held in trust. I should like the contracts settled within a fortnight." Mr. Pellinger wrote 3 lines. Then he set down the pen and looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. He had known her since she was 8. He had taught her to cheat, very mildly, at chess. "My lady," he said gently, "may I ask why? Castle Marwood is splendid, of course, in its way, but it is also remote. The roads are difficult 8 months of the year. The society is sparse. The nearest neighbour of consequence is the Duke of Wexford. Yes, I am aware." The room was very quiet for a moment. Mr. Pellinger, who had been the senior advisor at 3 weddings, 2 duels, and 1 celebrated divorce, allowed himself a small smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he was about to be useful in a thoroughly entertaining way. "My lady," he said, "is there anything in particular about Castle Marwood that recommends it to you above other possible properties? Many fine houses are available." "There is one particular thing, Mr. Pellinger." "And that is?" "The East Tower of Castle Marwood," Charlotte said, looking him very steadily in the eye, "has a window. The window faces southwest. From that window, on a clear evening, one can see directly into the bedroom window of Wexford Hall. I have ridden the ground myself. I confirmed the line of sight last September." Mr. Pellinger did not laugh. He had been raised better than that. But he allowed himself, for one luminous instant, to remember exactly why he had stayed in the law for 40 years. "I see, my lady." "I should like the contracts in a fortnight." "You shall have them in 9 days." Theodore Hawksley, 8th Duke of Wexford, did not sleep well. He had not slept well for 3 years. The fault lay partly with grief, which had taught him to keep the candles burning later than was reasonable, and partly with the fact that Wexford Hall was a building of such extraordinary draughts that the wind in November sounded as though something large were trying to come in through the walls. He stood at his bedroom window on a Tuesday evening in the first week of November, 12 days after the Hartwell ball, with a glass of brandy in one hand and a folded letter from Parliament in the other, and looked out across his own park in the dark. The park was empty, as parks are in November. The lake was a sheet of black ink. The hawthorn hedges had given up their leaves and stood like wire sketches against the lighter dark of the sky. The moon was a thin curl over the eastern edge of the wood, and in the eastern edge of the wood, in the black bulk of Castle Marwood, where there had been no light visible from his window for as long as he had been Duke, for, in fact, as long as he had been alive, there was a candle burning. It burned in the East Tower. He set down the brandy. He set down the letter. He picked up the small spyglass that had belonged to his father and that he kept on the deep windowsill for the purpose of identifying which of his tenants was poaching his pheasants. He raised it to his eye and adjusted the focus. The East Tower window was wide. The candle was placed close to the glass. By its light, he could see, very small, very distant but unmistakable, a woman seated at a writing desk. She wore something dark, perhaps blue or perhaps black. The spyglass was not strong enough to tell. Her hair was pinned up. Her head was bent over her work. As he watched, she set down her pen, lifted her face toward the glass. Toward, he realized with a small, cold lurch, his own window, and smiled. She raised one hand. She waved. She knew exactly where he stood. The Duke of Wexford lowered the spyglass, very slowly, and said one word that his late mother would have boxed his ears for. He walked to the bell pull and rang it 3 times, hard. His butler appeared in the doorway in something less than a minute, which was an achievement, given that the man had to climb 2 flights of stairs. "Hopkins," said the Duke. "Castle Marwood." "Your Grace?" "Castle Marwood, across the wood. It has been empty for years. There is a light in the East Tower." "Yes, Your Grace." "Yes?" "Yes, Your Grace. Castle Marwood has been sold. The new proprietor took possession on Monday." The Duke turned from the window. The candlelight caught his face and showed it for an instant exactly as it had been on the night of the Hartwell ball. Handsome, hard, and very, very angry. He was a tall man. He was a broad man. He had been a soldier in the long Spanish campaigns, and the soldier was still in his shoulders. "To whom?" he said. Hopkins, who had a great gift for answering the questions his employer ought to have asked, said, "To Lady Charlotte Ashby, Your Grace. The Honourable Lady Charlotte Ashby, of Kent, by private contract, settled the day before last." The Duke of Wexford did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, "I see. Will that be all, Your Grace?" "That will be all, Hopkins. Thank you. Send me word the moment Her Grace, the moment Lady Ashby, calls upon the village." "Yes, Your Grace." When the door had closed, the Duke walked back to the window. He stood there a long time. The candle in the east tower did not move. The woman at the desk had returned to her writing, and from this distance, with the spyglass lowered, she was only a small, pale square of light in the side of an ancient stone tower. And yet he found that he could not look away. He had said one sentence to her in his entire life. He had said it across a ballroom, with the intention of ending an inconvenience. He had ended nothing. He had begun something he did not understand. Wexford Hall, behind him, settled itself for the night with the small, distinct sounds of a great house that had grown old in the hands of a careful family. The small ticks and creaks of the panelling cooling, the distant murmur of the kitchens being closed up, the low note of a hound in the stable yard, the patient, rhythmic step of Hopkins crossing the long gallery on his way to the dining room. The Duke heard each of these without registering them. They were the night noise of his own life. He had been listening to them, on and off, for 31 years. He had been Duke for 3. He had been a soldier for 8 before that. He had been the eldest son of a careful father for 23 before that. He had married, at 26, the gentle, pretty, brave girl he had grown up next to, and they had had 4 years of a marriage that had been better than most men ever know. Quiet, fond, easy in its rhythms, before the fever in the spring of 1815 had taken her, in 8 days, and left him a duke. He had not been able, in the 3 years since, to imagine looking at another woman in any way that mattered. He had assumed that this was a permanent fact about himself. He had begun to make peace with it. He had even, in October, begun to consider that he should perhaps marry again, since the duchy required heirs, and that he should marry, when he did, in the cold, considered way that men of his position generally married, by alliance and consultation, without inviting his own heart to the meeting. He had, in this exact frame of mind, been an unusually easy mark for his cousin Vivian Pennington. He saw that now, with the cold clarity of a man who has been looking at the wrong thing all evening, and at last looks at the right one. Vivian had calculated, correctly, that a duke who had decided in advance not to fall in love would do almost anything she asked of him in a ballroom, provided the request looked, from a distance, like a kindness to the family. She had presented the cut as a kindness to the Marchioness. He had accepted that framing without examination. He had crossed the floor of the ballroom and said the 8 words. He had thought, at the time, that he was making a small sacrifice on behalf of a family obligation. He had not been making any such thing. He had been doing his cousin's work for her, in his own voice, in front of his own world, and he had inflicted a public humiliation upon a woman who had walked into a ballroom in a gown 9 years old because her dead grandmother had loved it. He understood, standing at the window, that he would think about that gown until he died, and that this was, on the whole, a fair sentence. The candle in the east tower did not waver. He watched it for some time longer. Then he closed the curtain, drew the heavy chair up to the fire, and sat down with the unread Parliament letter on his knee, while the grandfather clock in the gallery struck 11, and the great stone bulk of Wexford Hall held its breath around him. Castle Marwood, in fairness, had been built 400 years before the Hawksley family had purchased their first acre of the surrounding country. It was a stone house, in the old North style, with thick walls, narrow windows, and a great central hall whose roof beams were said to have come from Norwegian pine. The east tower was a survival from the previous century, round, 4 stories high, and crowned with a battlemented walk that an active person, if she did not mind heights and was wearing sensible shoes, could pace upon and see, on a clear evening, all of Northumberland between the river and the sea. Charlotte had pacing shoes. She had the boots of a woman who had been raised in Kent and had walked everywhere. She paced the battlement on her first morning in the castle, in a thick green wool cloak, with her hair coming unpinned in the wind, and considered the kingdom that was now hers. The kingdom did not, at this hour, look obliging. The wind from the river ran along the battlement in long, bright gusts that brought with them the smell of cold water and the faint, dirty sweetness of the late November fields. The wood was a smoke-coloured smudge to the south. The stone of the parapet was cold under her gloved hand and pitted with weather. A jackdaw, dislodged from somewhere below, lifted off the tower roof, circled once over her head, scolded her with the personal indignation that jackdaws reserve for newcomers, and dropped away across the courtyard. Below, in the small inner yard, 2 grooms were unloading the last of the trunks from the second wagon. A boy was carrying a basket of apples up the kitchen steps. A maid was beating a rug against the dairy wall in a steady, disciplined rhythm that travelled up through the stone of the tower and reached the soles of Charlotte's boots as a small, satisfying thump. It was strange, she thought, to own a thing of such size. She had owned dresses and a horse and a small spaniel. She had not owned a hill. She found that she liked owning a hill. She liked it very much. She liked, in particular, the small, mineral fact of the stone under her gloves. Her grandmother had told her once, in the long sick-room afternoons of the previous winter, that the difference between rented happiness and owned happiness was that one of them could be taken away by the weather, and the other could not. Charlotte had not, at the time, fully understood the sentence. Standing on the battlement of Castle Marwood, with the wind cutting clean across her cheek, and the entire weight of the tower reaching down into the bedrock beneath her feet, she understood it now. Mrs. Beale, the steward, who had been hired sight unseen by Mr. Pellinger, and had so far proved the soundest investment of the entire enterprise, came up the tower stair 2 minutes behind her, with a steaming cup of something that smelled like ginger. "My lady," said Mrs. Beale. She was a short, square Northumbrian woman of perhaps 60, with grey hair pinned under a starched cap, and a face that suggested she had once told the magistrate, to his face, exactly what she thought of his ruling. "Good morning, Mrs. Beale. I brought you a tisane. The wind on this tower is wicked, and you have been up here 20 minutes. You will take a chill." "Thank you. You are a treasure." "That is well known," said Mrs. Beale, without smiling. "Your lady mother would be pleased to hear it confirmed." Charlotte took the cup. The ginger warmed her fingers through the porcelain. She turned and looked southwest, across the wood, to the long, pale stone front of Wexford Hall, sitting in its formal gardens like a wedding cake on a green tablecloth. She asked Mrs. Beale, in the small, unhurried way of a question that had been sitting at the back of her throat all morning, what the village people said of the Duke. Mrs. Beale considered this question for some seconds, with the air of a woman weighing flour. Then she said, "They say that he is fair in his rants and slow in his speech. They say that his lady wife died of a fever 3 years past, and he has not laughed since. They say that he keeps his accounts in his own hand, which is unusual in a duke, and that he reads more books than is decent. They say that he was, before he was a duke, a soldier in Spain, where he was much wounded but did not die, which, in this country, is held to be a kind of miracle. And they say, my lady, that when he speaks to a person, that person knows he has been spoken to, for good or ill, and remembers it for the rest of his life." Charlotte smiled, slowly, into her tisane. "I believe I can confirm that last part." "My lady?" "Nothing, Mrs. Beale. A private remark. Has the Duke called?" Mrs. Beale answered that he had not called himself, but that Hopkins, who was his butler, had called twice on private business, once to ask the cook for the recipe for the castle's pickled walnuts, and once to inquire, in a roundabout fashion, who exactly the new proprietress might be. The cook, she said, had given in the recipe, and had told him that the new proprietress was Lady Charlotte Ashby, of Kent, late of London, recently arrived. Nothing more. Charlotte, looking out across the wood toward the long, pale stone front of Wexford Hall, allowed herself a small, dry remark to the effect that a duke's butler might go home with pickled walnuts and a single fact, and feel that he had done a morning's work. Mrs. Beale's mouth moved very slightly at the corner. It was the closest thing she did to laughter. "He will call himself, my lady, within the week. I shall expect him." He called within 4 days. The fact had been reported in advance to the village. Hopkins, the butler, had arrived in the inn taproom on Wednesday afternoon with the quiet look of a man checking that his employer's intentions were properly registered. And so by Friday morning, the entire stretch of road between Wexford Hall and Castle Marwood, including 2 cottages, a smithy, and the corner where the mill race crossed the lane, had assumed the patient, expectant atmosphere of an empty stage 2 minutes before the curtain. Charlotte had spent those 4 days in steady, unhurried activity. She had walked every room of the castle in turn, and made notes in a small leather book about which would be a sitting room, and which a music room, and which would, in time, be a library. She had ridden the boundary of the domain with her new steward, a young Scotchman called Mr. Macready, who was so impressed by her riding that he forgot to be impressed by her wealth, which was the proper order, and had committed to memory the location of every gate, ford, and fenced corner. She had received the vicar of the village, who was a kind, plump man with 7 daughters and an excellent line in stewed pears, and had committed to a donation toward the new church roof. She had attended 1 half-hour service. She had been, at all times, polite, attentive, and impossible to dismiss. She did not write to the Duke. She did not call upon Wexford Hall. She did not, on any of the 4 evenings, light a candle in the East Tower window. She wished him to come to her. There was, she thought, a particular discipline in the act of waiting. She had observed it in her grandmother, who had kept her father out of the will for 14 months, not by argument, but by the steady refusal of any further interview until certain conditions were met. She had observed it in Mr. Pellinger, who had once allowed a Hertfordshire baronet to call upon his chambers 7 Tuesdays in succession before granting him a single sentence of professional opinion. The discipline consisted, in essence, of doing nothing visible, while internally maintaining the entire structure of intention so that the moment, when it came, would arrive into a fully prepared mind. Charlotte practiced this discipline in the 4 days following her arrival. She did not allow herself to look out of the south windows toward Wexford Hall more than once in any given hour. She did not allow herself, when she heard hooves on the gravel, to lift her head from the page she was working on. She did not, when the candle was lit at 4 o'clock each evening on her writing desk, allow herself to imagine the candle as anything other than light to read by. It is possible that Mrs. Beale, observing her, understood exactly what was being practiced. Mrs. Beale gave no sign of understanding it. Mrs. Beale provided ginger tisanes at the proper hours, kept the small drawing-room fire steady, and reported the comings and goings of the village at meals with the same flat geographical precision she would have used to report the weather. The household, in those 4 days, ran with the smooth, slightly held-breath rhythm of a great clock that has been wound and is now waiting only to be told that it may strike. He came on the Friday afternoon at 3:30, in a black greatcoat and on a tall grey horse, with one groom riding behind him at a respectful distance. Mrs. Beale, who was watching from the still-room window, said one word under her breath that was extremely uncharacteristic of her, and went at once to the front hall to receive him. Charlotte was in the small drawing-room, which she had begun to think of as her drawing-room, working through her morning's correspondence at the writing desk by the south window. She heard the bell. She heard the heavy front door open and the murmur of voices, low and male, in the hall. She heard Mrs. Beale's quick step on the flagstones. She did not get up. She did not put away the letter she was writing. She wrote 2 more lines about the price of barley in Northumberland, not because the price of barley interested her, although it had begun to, but because she wished to be writing when he entered the room. When he entered the room, he was so much taller than she had remembered that for a moment she had to remind herself, deliberately, that she was not afraid of him. She was not afraid. She was simply made aware by his height and by his stillness in the doorway, that the small drawing room had become, by his entering it, slightly too small. He bowed. The bow was correct. "Lady Ashby," he said. She set down her pen. She rose. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head exactly the half-inch she had inclined it at the Hartwell ball. No more. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon for calling without a card. I find that I am your nearest neighbour, and I thought it civil to introduce myself before the village did the work for me. Your Grace has been my nearest neighbour for 4 days. I wondered when civility would arrive." He did not flinch, either. He had been a soldier. He had stood under cannon. A small, dark woman with grey eyes and a writing pen was not going to make him flinch in his own, he reminded himself sharply, in her drawing room. "It has arrived, madam, on horseback." "So I observe. Pray, sit down." He sat. He sat in the carved oak chair opposite the writing desk, which had been chosen by Charlotte the previous afternoon, after careful consideration, as the chair in which a person of significant height would look slightly less commanding than they ordinarily did. She watched him fold his long legs under it and resign himself to its proportions, and she allowed herself 1/4 of an inward smile. Mrs. Beale appeared with tea. Mrs. Beale poured. Mrs. Beale withdrew. The door closed with the precise small click of a steward who has spent 40 years closing doors and knows exactly how loudly each ought to close. She offered him milk, and he accepted it. She offered him sugar, and he refused it. She handed him the cup, with the small, particular care she gave to objects she did not yet trust herself to set down by accident. And as she did, she remarked, in the lazy, drawing-room voice her grandmother had taught her to use, for sentences whose teeth were sharper than their tone, that a man who took milk but no sugar was generally a man who had decided the world was sufficient as it was, and required only softening at the edges. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. The look was long. The grey eyes that met him did not look away. After perhaps 3 seconds, 3 slow, listening seconds, the corner of his mouth moved a fraction of a millimetre upward, and Charlotte understood, with a small inward jolt, that she had just made the Duke of Wexford very nearly smile. He had not nearly smiled at anyone in 3 years. The fact was widely known in Northumberland. It would, by next Tuesday, be known in London. He set down his cup. He told her that he owed her an apology. She acknowledged this with the smallest possible inclination of her head. He told her that he had been unforgivably rude to her at the Hartwell ball. She acknowledged that too. He said that he should not have spoken as he had spoken, that he should not have spoken at all, that the fault was entirely his. She did not help him through any of it. She watched him over her own cup with the patient, unmoving attention of a woman who had crossed the country in winter to receive precisely this conversation, and was determined to receive it in full, without a single sentence omitted for her comfort. When he had finished his 3 statements, she allowed the silence to extend an inch beyond the comfortable, and then another inch, and then a third, while the fire ticked in the grate and the November light through the south window moved a slow, yellow inch across the carpet. He took a breath. He had not had to apologize for many things in his life, and he found, with a kind of distant, soldierly amusement, that he was not very good at it. "I had been told," he said carefully, "before the ball, that you were a woman of a particular description. The description was inaccurate. I acted upon it without inquiry. The conduct was unworthy of me." "What was the description, Your Grace?" He did not want to tell her. She watched him not want to tell her. After a pause that felt to him much longer than it was, he said, "I had been told that you were a fortune hunter, that you had insinuated yourself into the Marchioness's family by way of a mutual cousin, that you were, in fact, a person of no particular fortune and no particular family who had come to London to acquire one or the other or both, and that the Marchioness, being soft, had not seen the imposition. I was, indelicately, asked to convey this to you, in such a way that you would understand that you would not be welcome in the Duchess's circle. I chose the public method. I chose it badly. Who told you this? My cousin, Lady Vivian Pennington. Ah. It was a small word. It was a complete sentence. Charlotte set down her cup with a sound that was not quite the chime of porcelain on saucer, but was very, very close. Lady Vivian Pennington had 3 unmarried daughters, an unfortunate complexion, and a tongue that had once, it was said, peeled paint off the dining room of a marquis. She was the Duke's first cousin on his mother's side. She had been a bridesmaid at his wedding and a chief mourner at his wife's funeral, and had, since his widowhood, regarded her own eldest daughter as the natural heir to the Duchy of Wexford. Charlotte had met Lady Vivian twice. The second time had been 3 weeks before the Hartwell ball. Your Grace, she said, very evenly. Before I accept your apology, I shall require something of you. Madam, I shall require you to go home. I shall require you to write to Lady Vivian Pennington, in your own hand, on your own paper, and inform her that you have called upon Lady Charlotte Ashby of Castle Marwood, that you have found her to be precisely what her godmother, the Marchioness of Hartwell, described, that she is in possession of an inheritance from her grandmother that is, to the best of your knowledge, of an extent comparable to your own annual rents, and that any further suggestion to the contrary will be regarded as a personal affront. I shall require you to send the letter by the morning post. I shall require you to send me a copy by the same post. The Duke of Wexford was silent for some seconds. His face had gone very still. Charlotte could not read it. She was not certain that anyone had ever read it. You have considered this in detail, madam. I have had 4 days, Your Grace. You have. And before that, I had a carriage ride from London. He did look at her then, properly, with something not unlike attention. He set down his cup. He folded his hands over his knee. They were large hands, a soldier's hands, with a faint white scar across the knuckle of the left index finger. And he said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, You shall have the letter, madam, by the morning post. You shall have the copy. And if it is any concern of yours, which it ought not to be, I shall regret the cousin who provoked me into folly until the day she stops speaking to me, which is, I think, the only outcome that will satisfy us both. It is some concern of mine, said Charlotte, since I shall be living next door to her cousin for the remainder of my life. Yes, send it. He stood. He bowed again, exactly correctly. He paused at the door. May I ask, Lady Ashby, why you bought Castle Marwood? Your Grace knows why I bought Castle Marwood. I had an opinion. I should like to hear it from you, if you will be so good. She considered him for a long moment. He stood in the doorway, very tall and very still, with his black greatcoat over his arm and his hat in his hand, and the November light falling sideways across his hard, beautiful face. And she found that she had to think before she spoke, which was not always the case with her. Your Grace told me, in the hearing of 200 people, to know my place, she said. I thought I should learn it. I have learned that my place is wherever I wish it to be, and I wished it to be here. Goodbye, Your Grace. Mrs. Beale will see you out. The letter to Lady Vivian Pennington arrived in London the following Wednesday by the morning post. It was 3 sentences long. It was written in a hand of such black and unadorned correctness that Lady Vivian, when she read it, sat down in the wrong chair and called for hartshorn. The copy reached Castle Marwood by the same post. Charlotte read it twice, once for content, once for pleasure, and then folded it and placed it in the small lacquer box on her writing desk, in which she kept the letters she would not allow herself to throw away. The lacquer box itself was a small, shallow thing of black and gold Japan-ware, its lid painted with a single crane in flight that her grandmother had brought back from a brief and unhappy season at Bath in 1791. Charlotte had inherited the box at 14, along with the writing desk on which it stood. The box had, over the years, accumulated a quiet, particular collection. A letter from a cousin who had died in the West Indies, a program from a concert at which something had been understood without being said. A single dried sprig of rosemary from her grandmother's grave at Wantage. 3 folded pages from a man at her second season who had paid her courteous attention for 6 weeks, and then vanished into a different family altogether. Charlotte did not, as a rule, look into the lacquer box. She knew its contents the way a very orderly person knows the contents of a drawer they do not need to open. The Duke's apology, in his careful, unadorned hand, joined those papers. It lay on top, slightly larger than the others, and somewhat heavier than its 3 sentences would have warranted. The Duke called upon Charlotte 3 more times in the fortnight that followed. He came on Tuesday with the deeds to a small parcel of land that adjoined Castle Marwood's home farm, and that, he said, had been incorrectly recorded in Wexford's Terriers since 1782, and properly belonged to her. He came on Friday with a brace of pheasants that his keeper had, he said, insisted on sending. He came on the following Tuesday with no excuse at all. Each visit lasted approximately 1 hour, which was the precise duration that the village had decided, by some unspoken agreement among its women, was permissible between a duke and an unmarried lady of independent fortune, in the absence of either chaperone or family. Mrs. Beale enforced the hour with the silent, immovable authority of a tide. At the 55th minute, she would appear at the door of the small drawing room with a pot of fresh coffee that nobody had requested. At the 58th minute, she would offer to fetch the Duke's hat. At the 62nd minute, the Duke would already be on the front step, taking his leave. He did not, after the first visit, remark upon this rhythm. He had been a soldier, and he understood organized retreat when he saw it. In the intervals between his visits, Charlotte continued the steady, ordinary business of taking up an estate. She walked the lambing fields in the rain. She ordered 3 barrels of salt for the winter pickling. She had the chimney of the small drawing room swept by a man from the village who turned out, on extended conversation, to be the brother-in-law of Mrs. Beale's youngest sister. She paid an old debt of the previous proprietor, a bill of £40 owed to a Newcastle saddler since 1817, and received in return a letter of such grateful astonishment that she was obliged to sit with it for a quarter of an hour at the window before she could put it back into its envelope. She wrote to the Marchioness of Hartwell. Again. She did not, in either letter, mention the Duke. The Marchioness, in her replies, did not mention him either. Both of them understood, with the silent clarity of women who had been corresponding about important matters since Charlotte was 16, exactly what was being not discussed. On that 3rd visit, the rain was very bad. He arrived without his hat. Mrs. Beale took one look at him in the front hall, shook her head once at no one in particular, and ordered the fire built up in the small drawing room before he had so much as set foot inside it. "Your Grace will catch your death," said Mrs. Beale. "Mrs. Beale, I have ridden in worse weather than this, in worse causes than this." "That is no commendation of either you or the weather, Your Grace. Sit down by the fire and dry your boots." He sat down by the fire. Charlotte, when she came into the room, found him sitting in her oak chair, with his boots steaming gently, and his hair beginning to curl at the temples in the way the hair of a damp man does. And she had to pause for a moment in the doorway and reset her own composure, because she had not been prepared for what the sight of the Duke of Wexford by her own fire would do to her chest. She had not, she reminded herself, come north to be charmed by the Duke of Wexford. She had come north to teach him a lesson about ballrooms. She sat down opposite him. Mrs. Beale brought brandy without being asked. Mrs. Beale withdrew. "Your Grace has had no excuse for this visit, I think." "No." "You have come merely because it is Tuesday." "I have come because I find that the days on which I do not come are longer than the days on which I do." It was a sentence which, in another house, in another season, with another woman, would have been the prelude to something charming and false. The Duke of Wexford did not say charming and false things. He had not the practice. He said it in his ordinary voice, the voice of a man making a quiet observation about the price of barley, and Charlotte felt the sentence go into her like the careful, unannounced point of a needle. "Your Grace?" she said, after a moment. "Madam?" You ought not to say such things to women you have publicly insulted in October. I had assumed, madam, that the woman I publicly insulted in October had purchased 400 acres in November precisely for the privilege of hearing thee say them in private. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire popped between them. Your Grace, said Charlotte very slowly, is more dangerous than I had been led to believe. By whom, madam? By yourself, sir. The reports were misleading. I have been told you did not speak. I do not speak, in general. You appear to have made an exception. I appear to have made several. The Duke of Wexford, sitting very still in her oak chair, with his soldier's hands folded over his knee and the firelight warming the white scar on his left index finger, considered Charlotte Ashby in the deliberate, unhurried way that a man considers a chess move he means to make, slowly and once. Then he said, Madam, may I be permitted to ask you a question? You may. At the Hartwell ball, when I spoke to you, you replied. Most women would not have replied. They would have left the table, or wept, or fainted. You replied with a sentence I have remembered every day since. Would you tell me, please, what you were thinking in the half-second between my speech and yours? Charlotte did not answer at once. She thought about whether to answer at all. She thought about the lacquer box on her writing desk. She thought about the candle in the East Tower window. She thought, briefly and clearly, about her grandmother, who had said to her, on a winter evening when she was 14, that the only revenge worth taking was the revenge of becoming interesting. I was thinking, Your Grace, she said, that you had paid me a compliment without intending to. You had decided to make an example of me. You had selected me from 200 women in that ballroom as the one whom your humiliation would matter most to express. I thought, he sees me. He does not yet know what he sees. But he sees me. I shall make him know. The Duke of Wexford did not move. He looked at her for some seconds. The fire crackled. The rain on the window thickened. You have made me know, he said. Yes. Lady Ashby. Your Grace. Was the entire purpose of this castle to make me know? She considered the question with care. She could feel, in the silence between them, the small, ridiculous, dangerous shape of an honest answer trying to push up through her ribs. She watched it. She let it come. It was the purpose of the first letter to my solicitor, she said. It was not the purpose of the second. What was the purpose of the second? The second letter was sent the morning after my carriage stopped at a coaching inn at Stamford, where the innkeeper's wife was kind to me without knowing my name, and I realized that I had spent 12 years in London being known by my name and not seen, and that I was tired of it. The second letter was a request for the recipe for her partridge pie. He looked at her. The look was different now. It had moved, in the last sentence, from a man considering a chess move to a man considering whether to lay down the chessboard altogether. Madam, Your Grace, will you, when the rain stops, walk with me in the wood? Yes. The wood between Wexford Hall and Castle Marwood had once been, 400 years previously, a single deer park, and although the boundary had moved twice and the ownership 3 times, the trees themselves had not noticed. They were ancient oaks, in the most part, with a scattering of hornbeam and hazel along the lower parts. In November they stood bare and grey and architectural, and the leaves on the ground had begun to compact into the particular soft brown silence that an autumn wood acquires after a fortnight of rain. Charlotte walked beside the Duke in her green cloak and her stout boots. He walked beside her in his greatcoat. He had brought a stick because he had said, gravely, that the path was muddy. He had not offered her his arm, because he had read her better than that. They walked for half a mile, in something which began as silence, and turned, at some imperceptible point, into companionship. I should tell you, madam, he said at last, when they had reached a fallen oak that had lain across the path long enough to grow moss along its full length, that the country will speak of us if we are seen walking together, I am aware of that, Your Grace. You do not mind? I bought a castle within view of your bedroom window, sir. I had assumed that a measure of village comment was unavoidable from the start. A short laugh escaped him. It was not a graceful sound. It was the sound of a man who had not laughed in a very long time and had forgotten the shape of the muscles required. He caught it back at once, as if it had embarrassed him, and Charlotte, walking beside him, felt, for the first time, properly, a small warmth move through her ribs that had nothing to do with revenge. "My Grace," she said, in a tone she had not heard from her own mouth in years. "You are permitted to laugh in the wood. The wood does not gossip. The wood is in the pay of the Pennington family. Even so." They sat down, after some minutes, on the fallen oak. He set the stick across his knees. She arranged her cloak and clasped her hands. "Lady Ashby." "Your Grace?" "You said in the drawing room that you had been 12 years in London, known by your name and not seen." "Yes." "Will you tell me what that means?" She did not answer immediately. She had not told this to anyone in 12 years. She had told it, fragments at a time, to her grandmother, but her grandmother had died last March, and the telling had died with her. Telling it to a man she had met in October, on a fallen oak in a wet wood, ought to have struck her as absurd. It did not strike her as absurd. "I came to London at 14, she said. "My mother had died. My father had a difficulty. He drank in the way that some gentlemen drink, which is to say, immoderately and without hope of correction. My grandmother, who was a strong-minded woman, removed me to her own house, and there I lived. I was presented at 17. I was, you must understand, Your Grace, the Ashbys are not a fashionable family. We are a sound one, but we are not fashionable. I was presented in my grandmother's ruby silk, which had been cut down and retrimmed, and was not, by London standards, what I should have worn. You wore it to the Hartwell ball, the same gown." She turned her head sharply. "How can you possibly remember the gown?" "I remember the gown." "It is the same gown, yes. She had it made for me when I was 17. I have worn it to every ball I have hated for 9 years, on the ground that if I am to be insulted in something, I shall be insulted in the dress my grandmother loved." "Madam, at my first season, I was pleasant enough, I think. I was not striking. I had no fortune that anyone knew of. I had a name, an Ashby name, but the name carried little weight. I danced. I did not marry. The next season I danced. I did not marry. The third season I beg your pardon, Your Grace, this is tedious." "It is not tedious. By the fourth season I had become, what is the word the dressmakers use? Unnude. I was a known face. I was a slightly older face. I was at the corner of every supper table, never quite asked, and never quite uninvited. My grandmother, who saw what was happening, removed me from London for 2 years to nurse her. When I came back, last spring, I came back as a woman of 26, who was understood by everyone to have failed at the business of being 20. The girls who were 18 had displaced me. The matrons treated me with kindness. The men who paid me civilities did so out of a sort of charity. Lady Vivian Pennington was kind to me at a card party in May. I should have understood, then, that the kindness meant something. What did the kindness mean? It meant that she had decided I was harmless. It meant that, by autumn, when she required a person whom her cousin the Duke could be persuaded to be rude to, in order to demonstrate to a particular hostess that he was still in command of his social weight, I was the obvious choice. The harmless, dimming Ashby cousin from Kent. No one would defend me. No one would mind. "Madam, you did not know that, Your Grace. You told me so this afternoon, and I believed you. But that is what she did. She used me as a stick to beat the Marchioness. And she chose you because she has wanted you, since your mourning ended, to act on the family's behalf. And it was useful to her that you should behave badly in a public room. It made you, briefly, hers." The Duke of Wexford was very quiet beside her on the oak. She could feel the quietness as a weight. "I should ruin her," he said, in the voice of a man who had stood in another country, in front of a great many things he had been forced to do, and who knew the price of each. "Your Grace." "I beg your pardon, madam." "You shall not ruin your cousin. You shall write her another letter." He turned his head and looked at her. The look was very direct. "Lady Ashby," he said, "you are extraordinary." "I know, Your Grace." "I have been a fool." "I know that, too." "I should— Madam, may I— "No, Your Grace." "I have not asked you anything." "Your Grace," said Charlotte, "your face has asked me something. Your face is a very honest face for a man who does not speak. The answer is no, not yet, not so quickly. We have known each other in private for 9 days. I cannot be the woman who let a duke kiss her on a fallen oak in a wet wood after a public quarrel. I have been many things to the gossips of London, but I have not been that thing, and I shall not begin tonight." "Madam, I had not— I do beg your pardon." "Do not beg my pardon. The face was a compliment. I shall remember the face. We shall walk back. You may, if you wish, call again on Friday." "Friday. Friday." He stood. He helped her to her feet, with a hand that was steady and warm even through her glove. He did not let her hand go quickly. He let it go at exactly the moment she was about to ease it from his grip, half a heartbeat sooner than the village would have permitted, and half a heartbeat later than her own composure ought to have allowed. They walked back through the wood in silence. The silence was not awkward. It was, she thought, the first true silence she had shared with anyone since her grandmother had passed the previous March. The path between the fallen oak and the stone-pillared gate of Castle Marwood was not long, perhaps a quarter of a mile, but it carried them, in the slow, deliberate way of a path through an old wood, past several small landmarks that Charlotte, in the past 9 days, had begun to recognize as her own. There was the old hornbeam with the lightning-split crown, which the village called the Bishop's Hat. There was the badger set at the foot of the bank, where the chalk earth had been freshly turned over in the past day or two by the busy, nocturnal labor of its tenants. There was the brook that ran briefly under the path through a low stone arch, a Norman arch, the vicar said, and that, in November, sounded exactly like a person speaking too low to be understood. They passed each of these things in turn. The Duke, she observed, knew them all. He had walked this wood, in one season or another, since he had been a boy. He named, in passing, an oak that had been a sapling in his grandfather's day. He pointed, without breaking stride, to a particular hollow stump in which, he said, a green woodpecker had nested every summer of his life. Once, at the brook, he set out his stick instinctively to steady her over the bridge, and only at the last instant remembered that he had not been given permission to touch her, and converted the gesture into a small, soldierly indication of where the path resumed. She accepted the indication. She made no remark. At the gate, he stopped. The dusk was coming down in earnest now. The rooks were going home over the roofs of Wexford Hall in the distance, in their loose, complaining black skeins. He raised his hat. She inclined her head. He turned his horse's head— the horse had been led behind them by his groom— and mounted. He rode away through the wood without looking back, which was, she thought, the most generous thing a man of his disposition could have done in that moment. Lady Vivian Pennington arrived in Northumberland 9 days later, without invitation, by post-chaise, in a state of organized fury. Her arrival was preceded, in Charlotte's mind, by a strange, settled quietness in the wood and the village. A stretch of 3 or 4 bright November afternoons in which nothing in particular happened, and yet Charlotte found herself, at odd intervals, looking down the South Road, expecting the appearance of something. The Duke, on the Friday before, had come for an unannounced hour, sat by her fire, drunk her brandy, told her the story of how, at 15, He had broken his collarbone falling out of the lightning-split hornbeam in the wood, listened with patient attention while she described to him the planned drainage of the boggy 2 acres at the foot of the home farm, and ridden away in time to dress for dinner. He had not said anything that the village would have minded overhearing. He had not, equally, said anything that the village would have entirely failed to interpret. Charlotte, going back into the small drawing room after he had gone, had found Mrs. Beale standing at the window with her arms folded, watching the back of the Duke as he turned his horse out of the courtyard. Mrs. Beale had remarked, without turning her head, that the Duke would come to the matter in his own time, that he was a man who did not run, and that this was a quality to be commended in a husband. Charlotte had not answered. Mrs. Beale had not required an answer. She arrived in the village of Marwood at noon on a Thursday, took the 2 best rooms at the inn, and dispatched 2 notes, one to Wexford Hall, demanding her cousin's company at dinner, and one to Castle Marwood, requesting the favour of an interview the following morning at 11 o'clock with Lady Charlotte Ashby, on a matter of family importance. Mrs. Beale brought the note up to Charlotte, who was pruning the dead heads off the late roses in the south garden, with the air of a steward who has been handed a snake by mistake.
My lady, from the inn.
From whom?
From Lady Vivian Pennington.
Charlotte did not stop pruning. She did, however, become very still in the wrist, which is a different thing. She is at the inn?
Since 11 o'clock, my lady, with a maid, a footman, and 3 trunks.
3 trunks for what is presumably a 4-day stay.
3 trunks, and what I am told is a great deal of righteousness, my lady.
Charlotte allowed herself one careful breath. Then she resumed pruning. The shears made a small, disciplined sound against the rose stems.
Send her my compliments, Mrs. Beale,
and inform her that Castle Marwood will receive her at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Inform her that the visit is to be of half an hour. Inform her that I shall not be receiving general callers afterwards, because my lawyer is expected from Newcastle.
Is your lawyer expected from Newcastle, my lady?
He shall be. Send for Mr. Pellinger by the next post, and ask him to come north on the 8 o'clock from Edinburgh on Saturday. He will not mind. He has not had an entertaining week since I last asked him to draw up papers. Tell him there is a Pennington in the affair. Mrs. Beale, who was a Northumbrian, and therefore did not require explanations in matters of warfare, simply nodded once, took the note, and went back into the house. Charlotte put down the shears. She walked to the south wall of the garden, where the wall was warm in the autumn sun, and she stood with her hands flat against the brick for some seconds. The brick was warm. The brick was old. The brick had been there for 200 years before she had been born, and would be there for 200 years after she had died. And there was something in the placing of the palms against it, in that moment, that helped her find her feet. Lady Vivian Pennington had insulted her in May, in October, and again, by inference, in this morning's note. Lady Vivian Pennington had cost her a great deal. Lady Vivian Pennington was, above all, the woman who had told the Duke that Charlotte was a fortune hunter, in order to use the Duke's good name as a weapon. Charlotte did not, as a rule, hate. Hatred took up too much space. But she found, with the warm brick under her palms, that she had, over the past 9 days, between the wood and the rose garden and the candle in the east tower, moved into a position of permanent, settled, well-considered opposition to Lady Vivian Pennington. The opposition was not personal. It was structural. Lady Vivian would not be allowed to harm, by any further inch, what Charlotte had begun, in this country, to build. That was the only thought she allowed herself. Then she went indoors, and dressed for the evening. The Duke arrived at Castle Marwood at 6 o'clock, on horseback, in the dark, without invitation. Charlotte, who was reading by the fire in the small drawing room, heard Mrs. Beale's quick, determined step in the passage, and looked up in time to see the door open, and the Duke himself step in past Mrs. Beale's polite barrier. Lady Ashby.
Your Grace. Mrs. Beale, thank you. Brandy, please.
At once, my lady. Mrs. Beale closed the door. The Duke came forward into the firelight. He did not sit.
He stood with his back half toward the fire, and his shoulders set in a way Charlotte had not seen before, even at the Hartwell ball. He looked, for the first time in their acquaintance, like a man who had been a soldier in Spain. "Your Grace has come from Wexford." "I have come from dinner." I left the table. "Lady Vivian is at the table." Lady Vivian arrived at the table at 6:30. She remained at the table for the duration of one course, during which she informed me in some detail what she intends to say to you tomorrow. I left before the second course. "I've come to give you the substance of it, since the courtesy of warning seemed to me owed." "That was good of you, sir." "It was self-interested of me. Please listen." She set down her book. Mrs. Beale entered with brandy. Mrs. Beale set down the tray and withdrew. "She intends to threaten you," said the Duke. "She intends to say tomorrow that she has letters from a person in Kent, a clergyman, formerly the curate of your father's parish, who is prepared to swear that the inheritance from your grandmother is encumbered, contested, and uncertain, and that the funds from which Castle Marwood was purchased are not, in fact, secure to you. She intends to suggest, in the course of half an hour, that if you remain in Northumberland, she will take steps to make this matter public." Charlotte did not answer at once. She lifted her brandy glass. She tasted the brandy. She did not flinch. "The clergyman exists, Your Grace. He was indeed the curate of my father's parish. He left England in 1822 because of an embezzlement matter that my father, in one of his rare moments of decency, declined to prosecute, on condition that the man went to Canada and remained there. He returned, I gather, 2 years ago, much reduced. He would, for £200, swear my grandmother had been a Frenchwoman. The matter is laughable. But it is laughable in the way that any threat by Lady Vivian is laughable. It requires me to be either sufficiently afraid of laughter or sufficiently invested in not being publicly examined to pay her off. I am not afraid, Your Grace. I shall not pay." "I had assumed you would not. And you came to warn me." "I came," said the Duke, "for 2 reasons. I came because I would not have you walk into that interview in the morning unprepared. And I came because I intend, with your permission, to be present at it." "Your Grace." "You cannot possibly." "I shall stand in the next room, with the door open. Lady Vivian will know I am there. She will know I have heard every word she says to you. She will know, when she leaves your house, that anything she does next will be done with my full witness. I shall require that of her. I owe you the protection of my name in this matter, since it was the use of my name in October that put you in her path." "Your Grace." "Madam, I have not asked. I have informed." Charlotte set down her glass. She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face. The face was, she thought, the face of a man who had decided something the evening before that he had not yet announced to himself out loud. "Your Grace," she said, "I am grateful. I shall not refuse the protection, but I shall require for it my own conditions." "Name them." "You shall stand in the next room, with the door open, yes. You shall not interrupt. Whatever she says to me, however vile, I shall answer it myself. I shall not have you intervene. When she has left, you shall remain at Castle Marwood to take coffee with me, in the small drawing-room, in the open air of an established neighbourhood call. You shall, between coffee and luncheon, ride to the village inn, and you shall, in your own person, escort Lady Vivian to her carriage, which will, by the time you arrive, be standing ready in the inn-yard. You shall ride with her carriage as far as the boundary of the parish. You shall not return to Wexford that day, nor that week, nor that fortnight. You shall write to me from London, where you shall remain for 1 month, and you shall write to me daily. Madam, this is not a punishment, Your Grace. This is a course of treatment. The country shall see that you have done your duty, and then absented yourself. The country shall see that I have received an offence in my own house, and answered it without aid. The country shall see, from the daily letters which I shall, let it be known, accidentally, receive, that you have not abandoned me. By the time you return at Christmas, Our position shall be such that no further Lady Vivian can damage it." He did not speak for a while. He looked very steadily at her. He said that she had considered it in detail. She said that she had considered it since the note came at noon, and that the thinking had not been difficult, since she had been thinking in some form since October. The Duke was silent for some time. Then he told her, very quietly, that she was extraordinary, and that he had told her so before, and that he intended to tell her so again. She did not answer. He told her that he would write to her daily, and that he would miss her, and she met each of these statements with the small, steady consent of a woman who had decided, that night, to allow herself the luxury of being missed. He said good night. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The room held what would, in another season, have been said. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Lady Vivian Pennington was received at Castle Marwood. She was a tall, narrow woman of 52, with the precise posture of a woman who had been corseted from the age of 8 and had never seen a reason to stop. She wore mourning grey, although no one she knew was dead, because mourning grey lent a certain authority to a face that was, unfortunately, already reaching the age at which authority and ill temper are difficult to distinguish. She had the family's pale eyes and the family's long upper lip. She had that morning the expression of a woman who has driven 9 days in a post-chaise and has 9 days of grievance stored at the back of her teeth. She entered the small drawing-room. Mrs. Beale closed the door behind her. The door at the far end of the room, the door to the library, was, as Charlotte had instructed, open exactly 4 inches. From beyond that door came nothing. No sound, no movement, no breath. But it was, every one of the 4 inches of it, occupied by the Duke of Wexford, in his black greatcoat, standing absolutely still, with his arms folded over his chest, looking at the wall. "Lady Ashby." "Lady Vivian, pray sit down." "I shall not, thank you. I shall not be detained long." "As you wish. I shall sit, if you have no objection." Charlotte sat. She arranged her skirts. She did not invite Lady Vivian to take refreshment. "My lady," said Lady Vivian, in the voice of a woman approaching the lectern, "I have come into Northumberland on a matter of grave family concern. It has come to my attention that you have purchased Castle Marwood." "I have." "It has come to my attention that you have begun to receive my cousin, the Duke of Wexford, as a private acquaintance." "I have done so on 3 occasions in private, and once in the wood, which is half public, half not. I should put the count, in fairness, at 3.5. "You will not be flippant with me, Lady Ashby." "I shall be precisely as flippant as the conversation requires, Lady Vivian. So far it is requiring half a flippancy. I shall increase if pressed." Lady Vivian's nostrils flared a fraction. She had been speaking down to debutantes for 30 years. She had not been accustomed, lately, to debutantes who bit. "I have come, Lady Ashby, to acquaint you with the existence of certain documents." "The clergyman from Kent." "You will not pretend to anticipate me." "I shall pretend nothing, madam. I shall save us both the trouble. The clergyman is a Mr. Tanner, formerly curate of St. Anne's at Wantage, who was caught with 3 months of the parish poor box in his coat, and was permitted by my late father to leave for Canada in 1822, in lieu of prosecution. He returned to England in 1854. I beg your pardon, in 1824. Much the worse for 2 years of frostbite, and has, I gather, been writing letters of an extortionate character to several Kentish families since. I take it he has written to you?" "He has provided me with information." "He has provided you with a fiction in exchange for a small sum of money, which you have come north to multiply. The fiction is that my grandmother's bequest to me is contested by a collateral branch of the family. There is no collateral branch. My grandmother had 1 sister, who died at 14 of smallpox, and 1 cousin, who died at 19 of a fall from a horse. My grandmother's will is in the keeping of Mr. Pellinger, of Pellinger and Hod, who is at this moment at the village inn in Marwood, having come north on the 8 o'clock from Edinburgh, with the original document in a sealed leather case. He shall be at Castle Marwood at 1 o'clock this afternoon. You may, before you leave Marwood, examine the document at his hand. He shall require 3 witnesses. The vicar, the steward, and yourself shall, between you, suffice. After such an examination, any further suggestion that the funds with which Castle Marwood was purchased are encumbered shall be actionable, madam. I do hope I make the position clear. There was a small silence. From beyond the 4-inch crack of the library door came no sound whatever. But the silence beyond that door had a different quality from the silence within the room. It was, somehow, listening. "Lady Ashby," said Lady Vivian, in a voice that had become, over the course of the last sentence, 2 pitches higher than it had been on her arrival. "You do not appear to understand. I have not come about the inheritance. I have come about the Duke." "Yes, continue." "You have placed yourself, Lady Ashby, in a position of intimacy with a man who has been, who will be, destined for a more considered match. The Duchy of Wexford has obligations. There are families. There are alliances that have been understood for how long exactly?" For some years." "For 3 years, would you say?" Lady Vivian flushed. The flush moved up her thin throat in a single telling tide. "You are referring to—" "I am referring to nothing improper. 3 years is the length of the Duke's widowhood. I am simply ascertaining whether the alliance you have understood for some years is an alliance that has been understood by the Duke himself, or only by yourself." "Lady Ashby, you exceed—" "Lady Vivian, I do not exceed. I simply observe that an alliance which is understood by one party, but not the other, is not an alliance. It is an aspiration. I have aspirations of my own. They are at present centered upon 2 acres of boggy ground at the foot of my home farm, which I should like, in the spring, to drain into a pond. They are not centered on your daughter, and they are not centered on your nephew, and I shall thank you, madam, to keep your aspirations and my aspirations in their respective parishes." "You are impertinent." "I am direct, madam. We have not the time for indirection. You have travelled 9 days. You have, at the inn, 3 trunks. You have at the inn one of my old friends from Wantage, who is prepared to swear my grandmother was a Frenchwoman if you pay him £3. You have outside this house, although I do not believe you have noticed, the Duke of Wexford's horse, which has been tethered to my hitching post for the past 45 minutes. The flush vanished from Lady Vivian's throat. The face went, in a breath, from indignation to a frozen, calculating attention. His Grace has been my guest since the small hours, on a quite proper matter of family business. He shall, I believe, be wishing to speak with you before you leave Castle Marwood. Would you go through to the library, madam? He has been waiting." The library door opened all the way. The Duke of Wexford stepped into the small drawing room in his black greatcoat, with his arms still folded. He did not sit. He did not greet his cousin. He waited for her to look at him. She looked. What she saw, she did not like. It was not anger. The Duke's anger was a familiar quantity in the Pennington family. She had seen it in his nursery, and she had seen it at his wedding, and she had seen it across her own dinner table the night before. What she saw now was something colder and more permanent. The Duke's expression of decision. She had seen it precisely once, when he had decided, at 23, to enter the army. She had not seen it since. "Vivian." "Theodore." "You will leave Northumberland. You will leave by the post-chaise that is now waiting in the yard of the Marwood Arms. You will be accompanied to the boundary of the parish by myself. From the boundary of the parish, you will travel directly to London, where you will remain. You will not write to Lady Ashby. You will not speak of Lady Ashby. You will not speak of me, in any context which contains the name of Lady Ashby. If a letter from Mr. Tanner, or from any other person in your employ, reaches the press in any form whatever, The cost of its publication and the legal consequences of its content shall fall upon the Pennington estate in full. You shall not, in your lifetime, be received again at Wexford Hall. You may, at Christmas, send a card. The card shall not be answered. He paused. Lady Vivian, who had stood through worse than this from her own father, stood through it now in absolute silence. You have been, the Duke said, in the same flat voice, useful to me, Vivian, in the management of my affairs since my wife's death. You have been kind to my mother in her illness. I shall not forget either thing. But you used me to insult a woman in October who did not deserve the use. And I shall not forgive that, because I cannot afford to forgive it. The forgiveness costs too much. Good morning. He bowed. The bow was correct. He turned to Charlotte. Lady Ashby, Mr. Pellinger arrives at 1. I shall wait upon you again at 4 for coffee before I ride south. May I take Lady Vivian to her carriage? You may, Your Grace. Thank you. He held the door for Lady Vivian. Lady Vivian, who was shaking, very faintly, in the wrist, walked through it ahead of him. The hall door closed. The yard door closed. The horses moved. Mrs. Beale entered the small drawing room with a fresh pot of tea. She set it down. She did not speak. She withdrew. She closed the door behind her, with the particular small click that, in this house, meant, well done. Charlotte sat for some minutes alone, by the fire, in the silence, with her hands folded over her ruby silk. She was not, she found, shaking. She was not, she found, weeping. She was, in fact, hungry, in a clean, brisk, untroubled way. She rang for Mrs. Beale. She asked for cake. Mr. Pellinger arrived at 1. He came in on the Newcastle Road in a hired chaise, with his clerk, Mr. Whittaker, beside him, and the leather case containing the original of the late Lady Ashby's will resting flat across his knees. He had taken pains over the 2-day journey to ensure that the case did not leave his physical possession at any point. He had eaten his dinner the previous night with the case under his elbow, and had slept with it on the floor beside his bed at the inn at Borough Bridge. He arrived at Castle Marwood with the case clean, dry, unopened, and exactly as it had stood in his strong room in Lincoln's Inn since 1820, when the late Lady Ashby had called upon him for the last time to alter the codicil concerning her granddaughter's spaniel. The original will was examined in the presence of the Vicar of Marwood, the steward of Castle Marwood, and Lady Charlotte Ashby herself. They convened in the great hall, around the long oak table, in a square of pale November sunlight that fell through the south oriel and lay across the tablecloth like a blessing. The vicar, who had not seen so distinguished a document since his appointment, breathed on his spectacles, polished them on the corner of his stole, and read every word aloud, in a steady, careful voice that occasionally trembled at the more elaborate Latin of the formal preamble. The steward signed. The vicar signed. Charlotte signed. Mr. Pellinger took possession of the document again, returned it to the leather case, and locked the case with a small brass key that he replaced on the watch chain across his waistcoat. The whole proceeding occupied 38 minutes. Mr. Pellinger, who had hoped for dramatic events, looked, by the end of the half hour, as deeply contented as a man may permit himself in the presence of clients. Lady Vivian Pennington was escorted, at 2:30, by the Duke of Wexford, to the boundary of the parish of Marwood, which was marked by an old stone cross at the top of a hill. At the stone cross, the Duke raised his hat. The post-chaise drove on. The Duke turned his horse. He did not look back. He rode the 4 miles into Marwood village and the further mile across the wood to Castle Marwood, where he arrived at 4 o'clock, exactly as promised, and was received in the small drawing room for coffee. They drank coffee. They spoke very little. They stood, at one point, at the south window, looking out across the rose garden to the line of the wood and the long, pale stone of Wexford Hall in the distance. "Madam," he said at the window. "Your Grace, I leave for London tomorrow." "Yes." "I shall write to you daily." "Yes." "I have not said to you, in any room, what I should like to say." "I know." Save it, Your Grace, for the day you come back. I shall be here. She told him she would. She told him in the simplest sentence available to her, and he received it with the steady, soldierly nod of a man who had been given an order he intended to keep. He took her hand at the window. He did not raise it to his lips. He simply held it, briefly, in his soldier's hand, with the white scar on the index finger. He let it go. He bowed. He left. The candle in the East Tower window was lit that evening. It was lit every evening for the next 30 days. The Duke of Wexford, in his rooms in St. James's, did not see it, of course, but he wrote daily, as he had promised, on cream-laid paper that smelled faintly of his library, and his letters arrived, every morning, at Castle Marwood by the post. Charlotte settled into a pattern, those 30 days, that she had not previously known herself capable of. She rose at 7. She walked, before breakfast, the length of the long gallery, 84 paces, end to end, in her green cloak, with the spaniel at her heel, while Mrs. Beale's kitchen sent up the steady, business-like smells of porridge and bacon, and the bread that the cook had baked the previous evening. She read the Morning Post in the small drawing-room by the south window, the Duke's letter always last, set aside on the green leather blotter for after she had answered the more practical correspondence. Bills, tenants, the vicar's perpetual roof. She wrote her replies in the afternoon, at the writing desk, with the spaniel on a folded blanket at her feet, and the candle ready on the brass holder for the evening. She rode, on most fair afternoons, with Mr. Macready the steward, the boundary of the home farm. She learnt the names of the tenants. She learnt the names of the tenants' children. She learnt which fields drained in November and which did not. She approved the order for 2 new ploughs and the repair of a section of dry stone wall along the South Road. She received, on the 3rd Friday of December, the vicar to tea, and arranged with him for the parish school to be reopened in January, with the new schoolmistress, whose salary she would supply privately. She drank, at the vicar's request, 2 cups of weak tea, and ate a slice of his housekeeper's seed cake, and sent home with him, in the dog-cart, a basket of apples from the Domain orchard, and a bottle of her cook's elderflower cordial for his eldest daughter, who was understood, by everyone in the village, to be on the verge of an engagement to the Newcastle solicitor's son. She lit, every evening at 4 o'clock, the candle in the East Tower window. She did not now expect the Duke to see it. The candle was no longer a signal to a particular man at a particular window. The candle had become, in the way that small ritual objects become, a thing that mattered to her in itself. A small, brave, ordinary fact, set against the November dark, that she lit by her own hand, and tended by her own hand, and had committed, by the lighting of it, to maintain. 2 of those letters survive in the lacquer box at Castle Marwood, and they are private. The remaining 28 have been read by no one but the woman to whom they were addressed, and shall not be quoted here. It is sufficient to say that, by the end of the first week of December, the country had ceased to talk of the Duke and the Ashby woman, because the country had by then settled the matter to its own satisfaction. The Duke had absented himself when honour required him to absent himself. Castle Marwood had, on its own ground, repelled an attempted insult. Lady Vivian Pennington was understood to have retired permanently from Northumberland society. The Marchioness of Hartwell, on being informed of the entire affair by post, had written a single line in reply. "Well done, my dear, both of you," and had then sent a barrel of her best autumn pears to Castle Marwood by the next carrier. By Christmas Eve, the snow was on the wood. By Christmas Eve, the Duke was on the road north. He arrived at Wexford Hall at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in a carriage rather than on horseback, because the road was deep. He did not stop at Wexford Hall. He drove on, through the wood, in the dusk, with the lamps lit in the carriage, and the snow making a very particular soft sound against the wheel spokes. He arrived at Castle Marwood at 4:30, when the candle had just been set in the East Tower. Mrs. Beale opened the front door. Mrs. Beale, who did not approve of arriving without the proper notice, made a small, severe sound at the back of her throat as she received the Duke's coat. Mrs. Beale. "Your Grace, her ladyship is in the small drawing-room." "Will you be so good as to tell her I have come?" "I shall not, Your Grace. I shall send you in unannounced. It will spare us all a great deal of fuss. Mrs. Beale, you are an excellent woman. That is well known, said Mrs. Beale, and she closed the door of the small drawing room behind him. Charlotte was at the writing desk. The desk was scattered with paper. The paper was, he saw at a glance, a list, half a dozen lists, of things to be ordered for an estate in winter. Ploughs, salt, 3 sacks of flour, a dozen tallow candles, 6 yards of red flannel for the village school. The candle on the brass holder was lit, although the room was still bright enough by daylight that the candle was, for the moment, a small private detail rather than a useful one. She had lit it at 4 o'clock from habit, and from the steady accumulated meaning of 30 days of having lit it. She turned in her chair as the door opened. She saw him. She set down the pen with extreme care. Your Grace? Lady Ashby. You have come without warning. I have come. She rose. She walked across the room to him. She did not stop this time, half a foot away. She walked into the front of his greatcoat, and she put her face against the cold wool. And she stood there for some seconds. He did not speak. He did not move. He set his hands on her shoulders. You are, she said, into his greatcoat, extremely cold. I am. The carriage. There is brandy by the fire. There is also tea. There is, I have caused to be made, a plate of partridge pie. The recipe is from a Mrs. Wickham of the inn at Stamford, who was kind to me on a difficult evening. I should like you to taste it. He began to speak. She stopped him. She told him, with her face still pressed to the cold wool of his greatcoat, that if they were to do this, if he intended in this room to ask her what she believed he intended to ask her, he should have to begin to use her given name, since she would not be married by a man who had not, in any room, said it. He said her name. He said it once, the full version of it, and then again in the smaller form her grandmother had used. He kissed her then.
He kissed her once, briefly, with the careful precision of a man who has been writing 28 letters at the cost of his hands, and not asking, because he had given his word not to ask until December. The kiss was not long. The kiss was the kiss of a man laying down a promise, not collecting a payment. She felt it as a temperature change. She felt it as the clean edge of a thing decided. He told her, after the kiss, that he intended to ask her properly, in this room, by her fire, with the partridge pie. She told him that he should. He did. The substance of the question is private, and shall not be quoted. But the answer was 3 words, and one of them was yes. They were married at the end of February in the church of Marwood Village by the plump, kind vicar with 7 daughters, in the presence of Mrs. Beale, Mr. Pellinger, the Marchioness of Hartwell, the Duke's mother, and most of the village. The bride wore the ruby silk. She had had it retrimmed, very simply, with 3 rows of cream lace at the cuffs, and her grandmother, had she been alive to see it, would have approved of the cream lace, and disapproved of the size of the bouquet, which was extravagant. The wedding breakfast was held at Castle Marwood. The Duke gave a speech which was 4 sentences long, and which Mrs. Beale, afterwards, declared to be the finest she had ever heard at a wedding, on the grounds that none of the 4 sentences contained a single word that was not absolutely necessary. The vicar's eldest daughter, who had since the beginning of December been engaged to the Newcastle solicitor's son, played the church organ. She played it indifferently. The flowers in the church were the late hellebores from the Castle Marwood garden, with sprigs of holly worked in by the vicar's wife, who held that no winter wedding was complete without them. The Duke's mother, a small, neat, white-haired woman of 71 who had not been north of Doncaster since her own wedding journey, and who had, until the previous autumn, expected to spend the rest of her life in mild widowhood at Bath, sat in the front pew in a grey silk that suited her, and wept gently into a folded handkerchief throughout the service, and afterwards embraced Charlotte at the church door with the small, fierce gratitude of an older woman who had been spared the daughter-in-law she had been quietly dreading. Mr. Pellinger gave the bride away. The Marchioness of Hartwell stood as her witness. Mrs. Beale,
who had refused all suggestion that she should sit in any of the front pews, stood at the back of the church beside the village schoolmistress, the steward, Mr. Macready, and the cook, and observed the entire proceeding with the steady, settled satisfaction of a woman who had managed, through the careful calibration of pickled walnuts and ginger tisanes, the courtship of a duchess. 6 months later, on a warm midsummer evening, the Duchess of Wexford stood at the south window of the small drawing-room of Castle Marwood, with one hand on the wide sill, and the other steadying the back of a small brown spaniel who had inserted himself between her ankle and the wall. She was looking, through the long, pale evening light, at the long, pale stone of Wexford Hall, where her husband had ridden over to discuss with his steward the price of barley. The intervening months had moved her, in stages, into a life she had not foreseen. They had spent the first 6 weeks of their marriage at Castle Marwood, by mutual agreement, on the grounds that the great rooms of Wexford Hall, although splendid, were not yet hers. She had walked, with the Duke, the long galleries of his house every other afternoon, learning the portraits, his grandfather, his father, his late wife. She had asked to be shown the portrait, and he had taken her in alone, without speaking, and had stood beside her in front of the image for some minutes, and she had taken his hand and held it, and they had said nothing, and had walked on. And learning also the names of his servants, the structure of his accounts, the quirks of his particular library. She had been, by Easter, the Duchess in name. She had become, by the 1st of May, the Duchess in fact. She had inherited from her predecessor an assortment of small habits she had decided to keep. The Duchess's customary visit to the village school every Monday morning, the Duchess's contribution of a basket of preserves to each cottage at Christmas, the small private fund for the apprenticing of village boys to honest trades. She had inherited also a small private fund for the relief of widows in the parish, and had, on receiving the books of it from the Duke's secretary, doubled it from her own private resources without a word to her husband. He had discovered the doubling 6 weeks later, when the books had crossed his own desk in the routine half-yearly review, and had said nothing about it that evening, and had simply set his hand on the small of her back, briefly, as they passed in the corridor before dinner, and walked on. She had retained Castle Marwood. She had retained Mrs. Beale. She had retained the lacquer box, the writing desk, the green wool cloak, and the brass candlestick from the East Tower window, all of which had moved with her, in due season, to Wexford Hall. She had not, however, given up Castle Marwood. She came across the wood, in the warmer months, 2 or 3 afternoons a week, to walk in its rose garden, to consult with Mrs. Beale on its management, and to sit, sometimes, alone in the small drawing-room with the spaniel at her feet, and listen to the silence of a house that was, and would always be, the first house she had owned in her own name. She had been the Duchess for 4 months, and the wife of Theodore Hawksley for 4 months and a fortnight. She had been the proprietor of Castle Marwood for 9 months. She had not, in 9 months, lit the candle in the East Tower. The candle had served its purpose, and was now retired to a brass candlestick on her writing desk, where it would, she thought, remain. She heard behind her the small click of the small drawing-room door. "My lady. Mrs. Beale. His Grace is returned. He is in the front hall. He is asking for you. Send him in, please. He has come on horseback, my lady. He is in his riding boots. He may come into the drawing-room in his riding boots. I shall not have him standing in the front hall. As you wish, my lady." The door opened. He came in. He was indeed in his riding boots, with the dust of August on them, and his hair was coming loose at the temples, in the way the hair of a man who has been riding all afternoon comes loose. He smiled when he saw her, in the small, unfamiliar way that he had, in the past 4 months, slowly and carefully begun to learn. He spoke her name. She answered with his. He told her that the barley was up 6 shillings, and she said she should write it down. He said that he had come the long way home. She asked if he had come through the wood, and he said that he had, and that he had ridden past the fallen oak. She asked if the oak was still there. He told her that it was, that the moss had thickened, and that there was a robin sitting on it. She told him to tell her everything. He came across the room to her. He took her face in his soldier's hands, the white scar on the left index finger as familiar to her now as her own pulse. He told her everything. The robin, the state of the path, the colour of the late afternoon light through the bare branches, the number of leaves that had begun to turn. He told her, in the small, ordinary voice of a man making an ordinary observation, that he had stopped at the oak for some minutes, with his hand on the moss, and had thought of the day in November when she had told him, sitting on that oak in a green cloak, that her place was wherever she chose to stand. "And what did you think, Your Grace?" "I thought, my lady, that you had chosen extremely well." "Yes." "And so had I." The candle on the writing desk was unlit. The candle did not need to be lit anymore. The light in the south window of the small drawing room was the long, honey-coloured light of late summer in Northumberland, and it fell on the Duke and the Duchess, on the small brown spaniel, on the desk, on the lacquer box of letters, and outside the south window, the rose garden held the last of the high summer in its open petals, and beyond the rose garden, the wood was full and green, and beyond the wood, the long pale stone of Wexford Hall stood quietly in its formal gardens, like a wedding cake on a green tablecloth, waiting for them, as it had waited for them, in one form or another, since the night of the Hartwell ball. She turned in his arms toward the window. She set her hand on the warm sill. She said his name very quietly, and he answered, and she told him, in the small, careful voice she used for the truest things she said, that she found, after all, that she was exactly where she had chosen to stand. He laid his cheek against her hair, and the firelight of October, and the candle in the east tower, and the fallen oak, and the ruby silk, and the soldier's hands, and the partridge pie of Mrs. Wickham at Stamford, and the brick wall warm in the autumn sun, and the long midsummer light in Northumberland. All of it, every thread of it, gathered itself together in the silence of that one warm room, and rested. The Duke of Wexford had said one sentence to her, once in his entire life, in the wrong place, for the wrong reason, in front of 200 witnesses. He had said it across a ballroom. He had not, since the morning after the Hartwell ball, said it again. He had not, in 9 months, needed to. She knew her place. It was here.